marking 1 year since the first coronavirus lockdown was announced. Politics Live on BBC Two with Joe Coburn.
It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, Ian Blackford, Conservative MP Steve Brine, the New Statesman's Alva Ray and Christopher Hope of The Telegraph. A year ago today.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
The nation remembers the toll wrought by the pandemic. Should vaccination be compulsory for care home staff?
Well, no decision has been taken on this yet.
You are thinking about
but
it?
What yes, we are, and it's important.
And Nicola Sturgeon is cleared of breaking the ministerial code.
It's important to the Scottish people that they have independent verification and adjudication of that, and that, of course, is what they now have.
It's right, Parliament has the opportunity to vote on the motion of no confidence in the First Minister.
So today marks the day a year ago that the country went into its first national lockdown to protect the country from the spread of coronavirus. Well, at midday, a minute's silence was held in various parts of the UK, and those who've died during this pandemic were remembered also across the country and in Parliament.
Can we now please stand as I invite members to stand for a 1 minute silence?
So people there reflecting on everything that's happened in a pandemic that has in some way touched pretty well everyone. You can see their staff outside hospitals, in stations, at their workplaces, remembering all of those who have perished during this pandemic. My question to start the programme with you, Steve, is what could your government have done differently?
So many things. Obviously, and a lot of it will come out in the inquiry one day. I just come literally from the chamber now where we had the 1 minute silence and you showed the speaker there asking us to stand. It was really moving, and as many as could get in the chamber were in there. Look, I mean, I think, Joe, we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And we're in different boats because different countries have different cultures, different public health systems, different levels of inequality. But the whole world has battled this. The whole world has suffered loss to a greater or lesser degree. And this time last year, I think you have to remember this, there wasn't a good option. You know, nobody knew lockdown would work, such as we did it anyway. And the cycle of lockdown and release was pretty much baked in. And you saw that until the vaccine became what the Prime Minister described as the cavalry over the hill. If you're asking me specifically about things that could have been done differently, I mean, I remember back when I was at the Department of Health, and I used to get a regular infectious diseases report of threats and things that have been brought into the country, and they were on very small levels. We had then something called Test Track and Isolate. We might not have called it that, but that's effectively what it was. And I would be told about families that had come back from other parts of the world, or people who'd been travelling and had brought back infectious diseases, and they'd go to the hospital in the Wirral, and that's how we deal with it. I think we didn't have a Test Track and Isolate programme that was able to be scalable quick enough. And, if I think back to my exchange with the Prime Minister in the House of Commons on the 4th of November, I asked him as we were heading then into the November lockdown, I asked him what we didn't do at the end of the summer when rates were right down low, which we must do this time when rates come back down low. And he was very honest and candid in his response. He said, NHS Test and Trace has achieved many things with 500,000 capacity now per day. Where I think we should have pushed harder was on actually insisting when people are contacted, they isolate. It doesn't look to me as though the numbers or the proportions have been good enough. So I think, isolating cases when the numbers were low was something that we didn't do well enough in the summer, and we must learn from that now that cases are low again as we come out of this third set of national restrictions.
Ian, what could your government have done differently?
Well, I think as Steve has said, there will be public inquiries in due course, and we'll learn from that. And we're all human, Joe. I think it's fair to say that everyone has made mistakes through this. People have tried to do things on a best endeavour basis. We need to reflect today on the deaths that we've had over the last 12 months, the 126,000. It's a horrific number, and we should be thinking about all those that have lost loved ones. We'll all know someone that has been lost to COVID, and we should, I think, be reflecting on them. But clearly there are lessons that have to be learned, whether we could have moved faster, whether we should have gone into lockdown earlier again last autumn, of course. And I think questions about what has happened, as Steve has indicated, over test, trace and isolate in England, and the amounts of money that have been spent on that, and whether we should have engaged the public services to a greater extent than we would have done. But I think also we need to make sure that everyone recognises that we're not there yet. We're making enormous progress. The vaccination programme has been a fantastic success, and everyone needs to be applauded for the work that's gone into make sure that we get the scale of the vaccination programme up to where it is. But also it's about the economic recovery from here. Obviously, we've had ONS data today of 693,000 people that are not in work, and that young people are facing the brunt of that unemployment, and we need to make sure that we secure the recovery. And I'm saying to Steve, and I'm saying to everyone across the House, let's have that national conversation about how we build back. Let's deal with some of the historic weaknesses we've got, the problems with productivity. Let's give people hope that we can come out of this better.
All right.
But we're really going to have to think about how we do that, how we can get to that greener economy, how we can deliver a fairer society. We need to deal with inequality. There's a huge rise in poverty that we're seeing as we come through this. So let's engage respectfully and constructively about how we can make things better.
Chris, what about you? In your mind, what could have been done differently?
I think you have to take yourself back to a year ago. I mean, politically, you had a landslide government with a massive agenda to change, to level up. There were battles with the press. There was battles all over the place with the Vote Leave team in Number 10. I think they just couldn't quite believe the scale of what was coming to strike them. And there was a slowness, wasn't it, to lockdown. And they've learned a lot there. I think that lessons are they'll do more locally. They'll trust more local services more, I think. There's all sorts of issues that will come up in the inquiry. I'd love to ask Steve if he knows when that might start, by the way. Will that start way before the election, and how that's scoped? Because it could go on for years and years and years. But there's so much to learn, I think.
Well, let's ask Steve that. What's your response before I go to Alva?
I don't know when it will start, Chris, and I don't think anybody does or should. And let me explain why. I mean, Keir Starmer's said that, it should start when the pandemic's over. Well, if he knows when that is, then, I wish I'd got the memo. I think the fact is that right now there are plenty of people who have a great deal of knowledge about what went on this time last year, including Matt, including the Prime Minister and Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance. And frankly, right now, I want them focused on how we deal with the rollout, how we deal with the roadmap and making sure that we stick to the roadmap. I don't want them distracted by that. I don't think that would in any way serve the memory of those people that we're reflecting on today.
Alva, your thoughts?
Well, I think firstly on the public inquiry point, I think it's not just a question of timing. I think it's really important that is a judge-led inquiry. Otherwise, it won't be binding. I think we've already had some lukewarm commitments from Boris Johnson that there will be a public inquiry one day. But the question is timing and also whether a judge is involved. But on the mistakes that were made, I think everyone who's spoken so far is really in agreement that the initial failure to lock down early enough was possibly the biggest failure of the pandemic. And I think everyone basically is quite understanding of that this was so new at that point. I think what people will be a bit more critical of looking back will be the fact that we didn't really learn from that. I remember early last summer, the consensus already was that it had been a disaster, our handling, because we locked down so late. And the really important thing would be looking forward to potential future waves would be to just make sure we didn't delay locking down again. And I honestly thought it was inconceivable at that point that the government would make that mistake again. And I thought it was very likely that, we were already talking about the potential of a second wave in the winter as the weather got colder and as people moved inside more. But I thought it was inconceivable that the government would make that mistake again. And unfortunately, it did because of the political pressures and economic pressures and so on. And so we saw that several times. And there's research from the Resolution Foundation that suggests that 27,000 people died unnecessarily, really, because we delayed locking down before Christmas when cases were rising very, very steeply. So I think that's one of the big things. And also, as Steve... Sorry, Joe. As Steve pointed out, there was a failure when test, trace and isolate wasn't really working. The issue was getting people to isolate. Lots of people couldn't really afford to do that because statutory sick pay isn't high enough. And we never really plugged that gap, and we still haven't fixed that problem.
OK, well, listening to all of you reflect on the past year, we're going to go on and discuss through the programme a little bit like decisions that are going to be made in terms of vaccination and in terms of the unlocking, the roadmap out of the restrictions on coronavirus. But before that, Steve, where do you think we'll be in a year's time?
I think we will be still in a position where people are careful. I think we'll still be in a position where people wear masks in shops and on trains. I don't think, nor should there be, that should be mandated by the state. But I think that, in the same way as many Asian countries have lived with the fallout from SARS, and still wear masks, sometimes because of air quality reasons, which, of course, is a whole other subject. But I think you will still see people observing levels of safety, and masks in shops and public transport. I can see that it'll be there. But, we will have the vaccination programme, which is well and truly on schedule and a bit ahead of. Yeah. And I think there'll be a booster programme, exactly as there is for an annual flu jab. And that will be tweaked according to variants, exactly as it is with the influenza jab that I used to order when I was at the Public Health Minister. Okay. And people will have to learn to live with COVID as an endemic disease, which the chief scientific officer has made clear he thinks it will become. And as I said in the House on the day the Prime Minister announced the roadmap, I mean, look, the fact is that COVID will be added to the list of things that you don't want to get. We protect ourselves as best we can through the measures that we take to do that, and through vaccination programs. But you know what? People will still get it, and it will still hurt some people. Right. 22,000 people died of influenza in the first year I was Public Health Minister, and I think it is an awful thing to accept. Right. As you get older, you have to accept, don't you, that part of the human condition is accepting our mortality, and today is a sober reminder of that. With bells on, isn't it?
Chris, you wanted to come in on this issue, where you think we'll be in a year's time.
Well, yeah, but I was going to ask Steve about why his government is extending the Coronavirus Act by 6 months until September, when this lockdown is meant to lift by June 21st. Are we in a cycle of extensions of these draconian powers?
That is a very good question, Chris, and it's one that I should be asking in the House on Thursday. I understand with the Act. I mean, I was partly responsible for drafting parts of it when I was in office, that it can only be extended for 6 months. You can't just say, we'll have a month, thanks very much. There are elements of it that are being allowed to lapse. And we had quite a complex Dear Colleague letter from Matt Hancock yesterday explaining the bits that will lapse and the bits that need to continue. So the government say, for instance, that we need to extend the Coronavirus Act in order to protect the furlough scheme. Let me put politely, I think that is the subject of some debate. And that is the debate that I think it is. Right. And we will be discussing that in the House on Thursday.
Right. Is it too slow then? I mean, is the government moving too slowly? Because you said back in January, Steve, that actually the country should be moving in lockstep with vaccination. So will you be voting against extending those regulations and the Coronavirus Act on Thursday?
OK, so there are 3 votes on Thursday. One is to do with the procedures of the House of Commons. One is to do with extending the Coronavirus Act itself. Yes. And then the one is the regulations, regulations which basically put into law the roadmap. And will
you vote against any of them?
I'm not sure I will, actually, at the moment. I mean, I'm reading the regs very carefully at the moment. The only change from the roadmap that's actually put into legal wording in the regs is the extension, which I think you want to come on and talk about, which is the extension of the foreign travel ban to the end of June. But I mean, the point that I would make, just in closing, Joe, is that we have to believe in vaccines. They were the cavalry that was coming over the hill. Now, once the end of April has come and we have vaccinated 99% of those who will die from COVID, then I think the onus is even more on ministers to make the case as to why they need to keep restrictions in law on my constituents' lives.
All right.
And that will be the narrative, the argument that plays out on Thursday.
You're right. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Ailbhe, listening to that and on the basis of the vaccination programme so far, how do you think it will look in a year's time?
It's hard to imagine, I think. I wouldn't actually be surprised if some sort of lockdown was required at some point in the future, because we really just can't anticipate, even though the vaccine rollout has been very successful in the UK, it's very hard to anticipate the global picture, because it's not just about the British vaccine rollout, it's about the rollout everywhere, and whether new variants will emerge that are resistant to vaccines, which will require us to revaccinate everyone again. I agree with Steve, though, that some of the little behavioural changes that we've had to bring in will still be in place in a year's time. I anticipate wearing a mask on the tube pretty much forever.
Really?
Yeah.
OK,
there are many other reasons to wear a mask on the tube than COVID, I might add.
Yes, well, we don't have to list those right now. But, Ian, what about for you? Do you think life will be back to relative normality in a year's time or not?
Well, I think it's important that we continue to make progress in the short term, that we drive down the rate of infection. And Ailbhe is right, that the risk that we face over the coming period is going to be from new variants. It's going to be the mutation of the virus and the questions that will then raise about how we stay ahead of that curve, where we know that any top-up vaccinations can deal with the progression of that. None of us want to be in the situation that we're in lockdown for any moment that's longer than is necessary. But it's continuing to act on the side of caution in all of this, and taking whatever action is then appropriate to keep everybody safe. Of course we want to get back to a new normal, whatever that might be, but we must remain cautious in terms of how we deal with this. And I know we're going to come on and discuss travel and so on as well, but the level of infection is still at a rate which is really not acceptable in terms of getting as close to elimination of the virus as we need to try and do over the coming period.
We're not seeking to get to elimination.
No, exactly.
I didn't say elimination.
Should we be?
Well, close to elimination, Steve, is what I said. And I think it's fair to say that that's where there have been some differences with the Scottish government and the government in Westminster, because we did get fairly close to zero in Scotland last year. I'm not saying you can eliminate this, you can't, but we need to try and get this as under control as far as we can for the benefit of everyone, and then allow the economy to recover, to bounce back in a robust manner.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, look, the reason why I chip in there and say that is that, this is so important. COVID is highly likely to become an endemic disease like flu. And so, therefore, the test of a vaccine is not its ability to eradicate the disease, but to protect those who've received it against severe illness. We have to remember there's only one disease in human history that's been eliminated by a vaccine, and that is smallpox. That is why Sir Patrick Vallance is absolutely right to talk about this becoming an endemic disease. The purpose of a vaccine is to prevent people getting very sick. And it seems to be doing that incredibly effectively, including against new variants, before you even get onto a tweaked top-up version of the vaccine.
Right.
And that then plays very neatly into this issue around foreign travel.
OK, well, Ian, just on that, do you accept that?
I don't actually think there's much difference to what I've said and what Steve has said.
Well,
what we've got to do is to make sure that we drive the virus down from the current levels. No one's saying you can eliminate this. You're not going to be able to do this. It is going to remain endemic. But we need to get the virus down to a level that allows us to open up as much as we can. And I think that's the point. And I think, therefore, that addresses the point about timing as to...
Right. Well, then it's interesting that Boris Johnson said this yesterday. Let's have a listen.
On the continent right now, you can see, sadly, there is a third wave underway, and people in this country should be under no illusions that previous experience has taught us that when a wave hits our friends, it I'm afraid, washes up on our shores as well. And I expect that we will feel those effects in due course.
Chris, why did he say that, do you think?
Well, I think he's setting the terms of the next controls at the border. If you leave this country, you need to have a good reason, and here's the reasons why. But I think he'll find himself getting a lot of support from Conservative supporters and the government supporters who want the government to get on with and control this virus. I think people will wonder why anyone needs to leave this country, given the imposition it has on our freedoms here. I think he's saying it, but I mean, if you're saying it's going to wash up against these shores, well, why not get even further and just ban basically any travel overseas?
Right. Well, is it proportionate? Let's just show our viewers this in the Daily Mail: £5,000 fine for holidays abroad. Now, it is saying holidays, and for reasons that are not essential. I understand that you can go with exemptions for work or for study or to visit a sick relative or for a funeral. But is that proportionate? That will come in on Monday, Steve.
I don't think it is, and I don't know why the Prime Minister did say what he said yesterday. I mean, I think this goes to the heart of the issue of belief in vaccines. No one is safe until everyone is safe is absolutely true. I want to go to France next winter, and right now I don't know whether I'm going to be able to. But it's true that if you want to go overseas, but do we believe in these vaccines? So new variants of the virus that don't currently exist, they are possible. But to totally eliminate that threat, then we'd have to eliminate COVID everywhere in the world. To quote the Prime Minister in the House today, launched the roadmap. There is no credible route to a zero COVID Britain or a zero COVID world. Now, if that is the aim of some people, then I think they need to be honest about what they're actually guarding against. Are we living in? Are we going to live by fear alone? And what does that then mean in practice? Because that means a permanent lockdown and no return ever to international travel. Now, if that's what we're saying, well, then, my goodness, there's problems ahead.
Alva? I suppose I've actually just been struck while Steve and Ian were talking about this, that I actually think that the idea of an elimination strategy can sometimes be a bit misunderstood, because it is actually different to an eradication strategy. And in terms of other well-known diseases, an elimination strategy just tends to mean below a very low threshold rather than completely extinct. So I think it's important to get that right first. I think the thing is that I think everyone does believe in vaccines. The point is that the EU isn't very far progressed with its vaccine rollout at this stage. And so we're looking potentially at a situation where you have the virus ripping through populations across Europe. And also here, we still haven't vaccinated the under 50s who don't have underlying health conditions. And we don't really know what it looks like in the UK to have the virus spreading. Once things open up, we don't know what it looks like to have the virus spreading here like that, with the people most at risk already vaccinated, but younger people and healthier people not. We don't know really what that looks like in terms of hospital admissions. Certainly the risk of death is much reduced now that we've protected the most vulnerable, but that's still a little bit of an unknown. And I think especially with the European context where they're a bit behind, I think that, yeah, I think it makes sense that Boris Johnson is rolling the pitch on that.
Steve?
I'm sorry, Alva. I think we do know exactly what it looks like. 99% of those who will die from COVID are in groups 1 to 9. So that, of course, is not the under 50s people like me.
It looks like, though, of course, that's a separate issue to the pressure on the health service. And of course, the reason why we locked down was not actually to prevent a certain level of deaths. That was part of the picture.
Okay, well, let Steve
but the reason was that we couldn't have that level of pressure on the health service.
Okay.
Yes. And that has now gone away. That has not happened. The NHS is not. We're not at level 3 anymore. The NHS is not at material risk of being overwhelmed within the next 12 days. So we know exactly what it looks like when you haven't. We know exactly what it looks like when you haven't vaccinated the under 50s. It looks like a mild disease. The fact is that most disease, this asymptomatic transmission, it is frightening. We didn't know about that this time last year, but actually it rather tells you quite a lot, doesn't it? Because if you've got asymptomatic transmission, it means that not only do you not have any mild symptoms, you don't have any symptoms. And remember, don't kill your gran. when Matt said that? Well, now you can't because your gran will have been vaccinated. And this sort of goes back to my point, is that the purpose of vaccines are to eradicate serious illness in the most vulnerable.
All right,
and
but Steve,
ruthlessly, we have done that through the JCVI's advice.
OK, briefly, Ailbhe, because we're going to move on.
It's just we haven't seen what it looks like to open up with the most vulnerable vaccinated and everyone else going back to normal life. We actually don't know what that looks like in terms of the response on the health service. At the moment, we are in a lockdown. So that is literally an unknown, which is my point. We don't literally know what that looks like. And I think especially, a year into this pandemic, it crucially isn't just older people or people with underlying health conditions who have died. And I think, lots of people don't realise that they have those underlying health conditions or would be classed as vulnerable until they die of COVID. I think that's an important context.
Ailbhe, bottom line is there are lots of things that we don't know in life. I would predict there is more that we don't yet know about COVID than we do, not in terms of deaths, but in terms of economically, because so many people are sheltered by the furlough scheme, and in terms of non-COVID deaths. Nobody's talked about that yet. How many non-COVID deaths are there yet to come out because of lockdown? Governments have to consider all of these things in the round. They don't just consider the public health
All right.
advice.
Well, one of the things that is being considered is this story, which is in the Daily Telegraph. I'm just showing viewers, which the headline says, care home staff to face compulsory vaccination. And Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was asked about it earlier today.
It's already the case in the health service that vaccines are required in certain circumstances. Doctors are required, for instance, to take the hepatitis B vaccine. And we know that this vaccine is both safe and effective. Some care homes have asked for us to change the law so that they can require their staff to be vaccinated because of this duty of care. So absolutely, we're looking at that request. But I would just stress that no final decisions have been taken on this.
Well, that was the Health Secretary. Let's talk to Gavin Edwards from Unison. Gavin, do you agree with the Health Secretary at least considering the idea of changing the law to require care home staff to have the COVID vaccine?
We don't think this is the right approach. The vaccine's safe and we're encouraging care workers to get vaccinated. But the right approach is to persuade and reassure those who are yet to take that important step if they're able to take the vaccine. A debate about mandatory testing is a distraction from the real task, which is to do what we know works in other parts of the world and in the NHS about positive reassurance, and having a mandatory approach risks introducing a whole range of other problems which we wouldn't otherwise see.
But you do accept that it's 65% of social care staff who've had the vaccine, which is far, far lower than frontline NHS staff who are eligible. That's 96.5%. So you see the problem.
I understand why the government is concerned, but we think that the right approach is to put all their considerable resources into a huge campaign around social media advertising, around traditional media, in order to make sure that a tailored message for social care workers gets through, drowns out the misinformation. And we don't believe that has happened on the scale that it should have yet, and that's what the government should be concentrating on.
OK, stay with us and I'll get response. Briefly from you, Stephen, then I must bring the others in. Yes or no to changing the law to require staff to have this?
I think absolutely that should be considered. There's a duty of care that people have if you work in an elderly care home. Yes, the residents will have been vaccinated, but people who are vaccinated against flu still sadly die of influenza. Yes, it's a question for the moral maze on Radio 4, from Michael Burke sharpening his tools.
I'm sure.
And it would require a change in the law for us to do this. But the fact is, if you run a care home, then the residents, your customers, because that has to be looked at in that way, you have a duty of care to them as well as to the people you employ.
Right.
There's precedent for this. You have to have a Hep B vaccine in place to be a doctor. And frankly, you can't complain that, we quote through the care homes to the wolves and then allow people not to be vaccinated. Of course, we've got to try and persuade. Yes. Absolutely, we have. But there may come a point, and there is going to come a point, when that persuasion hasn't worked. And then we have to think of something else. Matt is absolutely right to be considering this.
Gavin?
Well, it's about what works. I think everyone agrees that the vaccine is safe and that social care workers who can get vaccinated should. But we know from experience in the NHS, and we know from experience in other parts of the world, that what works is that peer-to-peer reassurance, issue-specific reassurance for people who are concerned about particular impacts, and that's the kind of reassurance. Now, the government has that within its control now. It can do something about that now, and it's not happening on the scale that it should be. Instead, we now see we might maybe getting distracted onto a debate about mandatory vaccination instead of concentrating on the task at hand.
A distraction, Steve.
We can do both. We can do both. I know this is hard to believe. We can do both. I think we have worked. I didn't agree with the Unison comment that we haven't put enough effort into persuading. If I just take the health economy in Hampshire, where I represent Winchester, I know that they've worked really hard with care homes, with the staff, with the managers to persuade, to explain. I volunteer in vaccination centres myself, and I saw people come in and be unsure, and then there were conversations. Some conversations go on for hours and days, and eventually then people have been persuaded and had the vaccine. Of course, you've got to do all of the carrot first, but there will come a point where we have a duty of care, and then I think we're right to consider the stick.
Ian, any plans in Scotland? Ian, any plans in Scotland to change the law?
No, I have to say we've actually been relatively successful in making sure that both care home residents and staff members are vaccinated, and actually that was the earliest priority of the vaccination programme. And if I look at my own statistics from NHS Highland, we've got about 99% of care home residents have had the vaccine, and I think about 95% of staff.
95% of staff? Well, that's far higher than the statistics here in England.
Massively higher. And so I think government's really got a responsibility to push this. But you do it by encouraging people to do so. The circumstances where surgeons are vaccinated against hepatitis B is entirely different. We need to encourage people that it's in everyone's interest to do this, to protect themselves, protect their family. But we cannot do this by bringing in compulsion on the vaccination. That would not be the right thing to do.
Steve?
How is it different, Ian? At the end of the day, it's a requirement to practice.
It's a requirement for surgeons, Steve, so it's very narrowly focused. This is entirely different. It doesn't apply to all doctors, and it doesn't apply to other NHS staff. I think it's a very dangerous road if we're going to talk about compulsion. People should be taking the vaccine, and each and every one of us in public life have got a responsibility to encourage people to do that.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to do, but to make it mandatory, I would have very severe reservations about.
Chris?
Oh, so would I. I mean, who wouldn't? But at the end of the day, Ian, look, we're talking back today, aren't we? Looking at the last 12 months, none of this is ideal, is it? We wouldn't be having this conversation at all. We might be talking about the actual social care policy that needs talking about. There's lots of things that are not ideal right now, but we are where we are.
Chris, what are your views?
Well, I think Steve is right. I mean, I think you have to look at compulsory vaccination, because imagine a family. Matt Hancock could learn something from the Scots on this one and see what they're doing right, because it is completely something needs to be done, definitely. But it does open the window to legal actions and mass resignation by care home staff.
Ian, what were you trying to say?
The key thing is we've been able to do that by encouragement, and I think communication and leadership and all of that are really vitally important, and we've all got a part to play in that.
Right. Well, that is curious, though, isn't it, Steve, that the difference in the figures in terms of the statistics of care homes, I mean, you must be surprised by that.
I am surprised by it. I mean, I don't know, to be honest, Joe. I mean, maybe it's about the profile of care workers in England as opposed to Scotland. I don't know. But I know one thing is that Matt and Nadeem and the team are highly positive, focused people. Matt is exhausting to work for. He's so positive and energetic. I know
I'll take
that
your word for it.
Honestly, he's not leaving any stone unturned in trying to crack this one.
All right.
And if Scotland have got any advice, then always happy to see it.
Oh well, there you go, Ian.
I think it was the case that we got some criticism from others when we prioritised care homes right at the beginning of the vaccination programme, but I think there were very clear reasons to do that. Look, I'm not going to criticise anyone else, but we've got to make sure that we force the pace on this as much as possible, and encouragement is the way to do it. And that evidence is there as to where it's worked.
I think customers will drive this. I mean, I don't have any elderly parents, but if they're not alive, sadly, but if they were alive and they were in a care home, and I was customer of that care home for my parents, I would be asking the question. And I think the customer will increasingly ask the question.
Right, Alva, Keir Starmer Starmer has said he has reservations about making it mandatory or a contractual obligation. But listening to the debate, yes, there is a difference in the take-up in England and Scotland in this case. But what about the families that Chris has talked about? Families will want to have care home staff vaccinated, won't they?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I suppose my view on this is quite practical, that it is just about what works. And I think it makes sense, actually, that Matt Hancock is considering this, given that this is a problem in English care homes. You have to look at a range of solutions to that problem. I think I don't have the statistics on this, but I would wonder, given that in general we know that people from ethnic minority backgrounds are disproportionately likely to be working in these kinds of social care roles on the COVID front line. I think that it takes us back to the conversation about how to address vaccine hesitancy among communities that don't necessarily have much faith in the government or in public health. And probably if you solve that problem, the social care problem resolves itself. I mean, okay. Steve mentioned the sort of the broader social care context, and I think that's an important one to consider, that already there is a recruitment problem in this industry, and there's a sort of long-standing big challenge for the UK in terms of how it solves its social care issues. So I think that probably treating social care workers with a bit of kindness and trying to convince them that not only is this good for the people that they care for, but also good for them themselves is the best approach.
Gavin, thank you very much. Gavin Edwards there from Unison. Thank you for joining us. We're going to talk about Nicola Sturgeon. She's been cleared, the First Minister, by an independent inquiry of breaking the ministerial code. Let's talk to the BBC Scotland editor, Sarah Smith. Sarah, there have been other developments, though, haven't there, this morning?
Yes, there's been another report published, and this one is by the Holyrood Harassment Committee. So that's a committee made up of 9 MSPs, as opposed to the completely independent advisor who authored the report that was published yesterday, James Hamilton. Now, he found that the First Minister had not broken the ministerial code. Well, it's a slightly different story with this committee report. They are critical in some parts of Nicola Sturgeon. They say they were given competing stories by Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon over what happened in various instances, including whether or not she ever offered to intervene in the investigation into harassment complaints against him. He says she did, she said that she didn't. The committee have decided her written evidence is an inaccurate account of what happened, and that therefore she led the committee on this matter. They also say it was inappropriate for her to carry on having meetings with Alex Salmond during this investigation, and that she should have promptly told the Permanent Secretary about it. And they say they find it hard to believe that she had no prior knowledge of any complaints about inappropriate behaviour from Alex Salmond before November 2017, which is when she says she was very first alerted to it. Now, because this is a committee made up of MSPs, not an independent advisor, it's much easier for Nicola Sturgeon or for the Scottish Government to dismiss this and say it's all party politics. This is the opposition just trying to criticise the First Minister in advance of an election for obvious political reasons. And it does have to be said that every time it came to one of these points in the report where they were critical of Nicola Sturgeon, they had to have a vote on it, and it was 5-4, the 4 SNP members of the committee voting against criticising Nicola Sturgeon, the 5 opposition members voting in favour of it.
And what's happening later on today?
This afternoon there will be a vote of no confidence in the Scottish Parliament. Now, it's the Scottish Conservatives who have asked for this, and they'd tabled it before they'd seen either of these reports, actually. But they say there is clear evidence in what has been reported today that Parliament was misled. They note that James Hamilton, the independent advisor who reported yesterday, that he did clearly say it's for the Scottish Parliament to decide whether, in fact, they were misled by the First Minister. So the Tories say, well, this is their chance to do that. But it's almost certain that Nicola Sturgeon will survive this vote of no confidence. Although the SNP don't have an overall majority in Holyrood, the Greens have said that they will support the SNP. Those two parties together make a majority. And so the chances of the Conservatives actually managing to land a blow on Nicola Sturgeon and say that they have no confidence in her look very slim.
Sarah Smith, thank you very much there in Edinburgh. Steve, why are the Tories bothering with this no confidence vote this afternoon?
Well, I think Sarah put it very well there, didn't she? James Hamilton said it yesterday. It's for the Scottish Parliament to decide whether, in fact, they were misled. And the committee verdict says that Nicola misled.
Oh, Steve, you seem to be getting quieter and quieter. At least I can't hear you. Ian, you heard the beginning there. It is important, isn't it, to have this vote? Because although Nicola Sturgeon's been cleared by the Hamilton inquiry, there have been serious flaws in her handling of the investigation found by the Holyrood Committee. What's your response?
I think, we should remember that this is about women that came forward with allegations of misbehaviour from the former First Minister, and the interests of the complainers should be first and foremost in our minds today. But within all of that, the Hamilton report yesterday was absolutely unequivocal. It comprehensively cleared the First Minister of any wrongdoing, that she did not breach the ministerial code. And of course, even the Parliamentary Committee today has accepted it was the job of the Hamilton inquiry to deal with those issues. They were not issues for the Parliamentary Committee. What we're seeing, I have to say, is the Conservatives playing political games. And there's an election coming up on the 6th of May, and the people of Scotland will give their verdict on all of this and give their verdict on the First Minister. And I have to say, I think there's a lack of dignity with what the Conservatives are doing today. And let's remember that this motion of no confidence was laid before either of these reports were published. The Conservatives have made a judgment on the First Minister without seeing any of the evidence.
All right, Steve?
Well, I don't know what happened on my microphone there. Apologies. I don't know the procedure in the Scottish Parliament, but maybe they had to lay it. And, of course, they don't have to move it today if they decided not to, but I think they will. All I was saying is, James Hamilton was clear that it's for the Scottish Parliament to decide whether they were misled. The committee verdict says that Nicola misled Parliament and the public. And so let the elected Scottish Parliament can make its decision. All I would say is, I know that the organised trolling will be out there as it was last time I was on the show and said anything about the SNP. So, hello to all of them. But I guess the question I would ask is, and maybe the voters in Scotland will ask, is who's running Scotland right now? Life in the bunker is all consuming when you're battling a crisis. And this just seems to go on and on. And who's dealing with the matters of running the country right now? Because at the heart of this are women who were let down by the system. And now there's another woman at the heart of this, Nicola Sturgeon.
Right, well,
I would have thought that most people just want to get on with the business of running the country.
I mean, it's fair enough, isn't it, Ian, to allow Parliament to have its say?
Of course, Parliament can have its say. Parliamentarians are sent there to do that. But at the end of the day, the fundamental point is that the Hamilton report has cleared the First Minister of any wrongdoing. And this question that Steve is putting about who's running the government, well, the government in Edinburgh, the Scottish Government are running the government. The First Minister is getting on with her job. And I've repeatedly made the point this has to be about the women. And I absolutely accept that there were issues with the Scottish Government process. The women have been let down. And what's really important out of all of this is that we learn from this, that we make sure that women are properly protected, that they can come forward, that they will be listened to, and action will be taken. And there's a real sadness that people have not had justice in this regard. We should stop playing political games with all of that and remember what's important. And I have to say...
Well, Steve, let me put that to Steve. Stop playing political games, he says.
Oh, my goodness. I mean, this is not just about politics, but I mean, Ian, Ian's a lovely fellow who I enjoy working with very much in the House of Commons. Next time something blows up here in Westminster, I'll look forward to seeing the lack of, quotes, party political games from the SNP members here. At the end of the day, the Scottish Parliament is an august institution that can express its opinion. And, if I was the Greens in Scotland, I'm not sure where I'd side today, but, that's up to them. That's their funeral. The Scottish Conservatives, the opposition, they're perfectly entitled to put a motion and members can make their views clear.
Right. Chris?
I just wonder how it might affect the result of the election on the 6th of May, and whether this may have cost the SNP their likely overhaul majority as it looked like. I was talking to some senior Tories last night. I said better or worse. One said better. She's the biggest single reason our people come out to vote. Other one said worse. So I think the jury is out, but it could be a problem.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of my guests for today. Boris Johnson has a press conference later on today, and I'll be back at 11:15. We'll have Prime Minister's questions from all of us here. Have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.